Recorded Books Incorporated presents an unabridged recording of Nimitz Class by Patrick Robinson, narrated by George Guidall. This work, copyrighted 1997 by Patrick Robinson, is recorded by arrangement with HarperCollins. This recording is copyrighted 1997 by Recorded Books Incorporated. The United States Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, Thomas Jefferson, is a $1 billion state-of-the-art war machine. At the moment, secure in the heart of the battle group it commands, it dominates its 1,000-mile radius patrol area in the Arabian Sea. 6,000 crew members are aboard, preserving the peace and guarding the Western Allied interests in the strategically vital waters near the Straits of Hormuz. And now, Nimitz Class.
Author's Note. Imagine New York's Empire State Building turned flat on its side, moving across the ocean at around 30 knots, a big white bow wave surging over its radio tower, and you have a good approximation of a 100,000-ton U.S. Navy aircraft carrier on patrol. The huge $4 billion warship is 1,100 feet long and powered by its own private nuclear plant. This is the Colossus, the Nimitz-class carrier, named after the Texas-born World War II Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who masterminded the ambush which destroyed the Japanese at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, sinking 4 of Admiral Yamamoto's finest aircraft carriers and 332 of his aircraft. Today, these modern U.S. carriers rove the oceans in his name, ruling a 500-mile radius of air, sea, and land wherever they move. But the Nimitz-class giants do not travel alone. They are normally accompanied by a small flotilla of guided missile cruisers, destroyers and frigates, and 2 hunter-killer submarines. Loosely arranged in classical operational disposition, this carrier battle group is known in Navy shorthand as the CVBG. The group is the undisputed master of the skies, the oceans, and the dark, menacing reaches of the kingdoms beneath the waves. Alone on his bridge, the admiral who commands it looks out of the biggest, fastest, deadliest warship ever built. He is the warlord of the 21st century. At the hub of his 10-ship surface group, there are 80 fighter attack aircraft arrayed on the deck, with the guided missile escorts in loose proximity. The Admiral's nuclear submarines ride shotgun far out in front. Smaller countries of military wealth and sophistication, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, lack the capacity to raise even one comparable force. Not even Russia, with its gigantic moribund navy, can match the power of the American carrier battle group. The USA runs 12 of them, each carrier alone costing $440 million a year to operate. 55% of the money spent annually on defense by all countries is expended by the Pentagon. Night watch, midrats. 3 times a day the whistle blows, and they begin unpacking food from boxes on a scale almost beyond belief. Sometimes hundreds of big, gleaming cans of ravioli or meatballs are being thrown simultaneously, expertly, from the unpackers to the kitchen hands, then on to the cooks. A big deck carrier stands about 24 stories high from keel to masthead, with a 260-foot wide flight deck. She draws 40 feet below the waterline. Powered by 2 big GE PWR nuclear reactors, her range and time at sea are almost infinite, limited only by the stamina of the crew. In addition, there are 4 steam turbines generating 260,000 horsepower. 4 propeller shafts, each the size of a 100-year-old California redwood, drive her forward. Of her 6,000 personnel, 3,184 are concerned solely with moving the great warship safely about the oceans. There are 2,800 air crew on board, responsible for flight operations and maintenance of the aircraft. The admiral, whose concerns are battle group strategy, tactics, efficient firepower, and surveillance of a potential enemy, travels with a staff of 25 officers and 45 men. His operations center is the bottom line of the U.S. Navy's offensive and defensive charter. The admiral can, at will, move heavy United States muscle closer to an enemy's border than any other commander in history. He can move freely through international waters. He is completely mobile, self-contained, and deadly to any opponent. In the bowels of the ship, there are stored missiles with nuclear warheads. The carrier is flanked by Aegis missile cruisers, whose computer-controlled weapons can hit and obliterate an incoming air attack traveling at up to twice the speed of sound. The battle group's close-in destroyers can take care of any air, surface, or underwater threats. The guided missile frigates, with their LAMPS helicopters, provide an anti-submarine dragnet which can stretch for hundreds of miles in every direction. The hunter-killer submarines, which can stay underwater for years if necessary, patrol hundreds of miles, clearing the trail for the carrier and its consorts. Armed with wickedly accurate wire-guided torpedoes and cruise missiles, they seek principally to destroy their enemy counterparts. A vast electronics system ties the group together in a tight network of communications, relaying minute by minute, ops room to ops room, ship to ship, the operational state of this moving cell of almost inconceivable power. The carrier battle group is perfectly capable of eliminating simultaneously threat from air, surface, and underwater. The spearhead of its attack is its bomber force. 20 deadly accurate all-weather aircraft, arch enemies to any ship hostile to the United States, plus 20 FA-18 supersonic fighter attack Hornets. To defend the battle group or to provide cover for the bomber force, there are another 20 fighter aircraft, principally the heavily gunned missile-launching F-14 Tomcat, and the supersonic F-14, usually 4 EA-6B Prowlers, another heavy hitter which possesses the unique ability to jam enemy radar completely, rendering any opponent impotent, a sitting duck for the U.S. air offensive line. The other great electronic specialist aircraft on deck is the S-3 Viking, a search-and-strike torpedo-launching attack plane which can probe underwater from the air and destroy an enemy submarine hundreds of miles out from the main group. On deck and in the hangars below there is usually a fleet of 8 helicopters, Cobra gunships, Sea Kings, and probably one massive CH-53 transporter which can carry and land either attack or rescue teams of up to 55 United States Marines. The aircraft carrier itself is equipped with missile and gunnery capability, the Nimitz class being the most heavily armored warship afloat. Her double hull and heavy sealed compartments along the waterline make her easily the most survivable warship in naval history. Every major team needs a quarterback, and in the CVBG, the big plays are called by the E-2C Early Warning and Control Hawkeye. With its great radar dome sending and receiving the electronic beams above the aircraft's computerized ops room, this heavyweight naval warplane makes it just about impossible for any enemy to move undetected within a 1,000-mile range of the carrier. The carrier's strike aircraft can travel far and fast, and on the surface the carrier itself can travel up to 500 miles in a day, controlling the sea wherever she sails. With 40 of America's 42 allies residing across various oceans from the U.S. mainland, it is as well that 85% of all the land on this planet lies within range of an American carrier battle group, as well as 95% of the world's people. Yet few of these hundreds of millions of citizens realize their lives are lived in comparative peace and security because of the iron-fisted defense capability of the United States Navy. Most of them believe this security has been orchestrated by the United Nations, or NATO, or by some quasi-European defense project. But when push comes to shove, it is the U.S. carrier battle group, the fortress at sea, that matters. This is the force which is apt to show up off the shores of potential aggressors. Unreachable by air or sea attack, virtually unsinkable by any conventional underwater weapon, surrounded by a wall of fighter aircraft, guided missiles, and tracking electronics, protected 24 hours a day by a sweeping, computerized radar field, home to its own bomber airstrike force. No word in the English language accurately describes the invincibility of the U.S. Navy's aircraft carriers, save one: impregnable. Almost. Prologue. Deep in the Aegean Sea, halfway between the Greek mainland and the long western headland of Crete, lies the rough and rugged island of Kythera. It is a coarse rock, 20 miles long at most, set in the middle of a shining and bejeweled sea. Along the eastern end of the Mediterranean there is a pure, transparent light which seems to flood the depths of the water. This is a paradise for visiting scuba divers, but for local fishermen the azure ocean that surrounds them is a harsh and unforgiving place. There are not enough fish anymore, and life is as hard as it has ever been. It was 5 a.m. on a hot morning early in July. The sun was just rising, and the fishing boat was sailing close to the rocky shore on the south side. Up on the port side of the bow, his feet trailing over the side, sat 16-year-old Dimitrios Morakis. He was in deep trouble. On the previous afternoon he had managed to lose the only good net his family owned, and now his father, Stephanos, sat, unshaven and grumpy, on the tiller. The man was secretly proud of his golden-skinned son, and he stared at the boy's Etruscan nose, a mirror image of his own, and the large hands, too powerful for the slender, youthful body. The boy's genetic bounty from a long line of Kytheran fishermen. Nonetheless, Stephanos was still peevish. "We'd better find it," he said unnecessarily. And in a light morning breeze they slapped along against the wavelets, while out to the east, for a few translucent moments, the earth seemed to rise up through veils of scarlet and violet. The net showed up more or less where Stephanos thought it would be, driven into a curved outcrop of rock by the unvarying Aegean currents. Lost nets had been washing up against those particular rocks for centuries. The problem was, it was jammed. Working in the water for almost half an hour, Dimitrios was unable to free it. "It's caught up way below the surface," he yelled to his father. "I'll get back on the boat and then dive deep with a fishing knife." 3 minutes later the boy split the water head first, kicking his way downwards. In the crystal-clear depths he found the bottom of the net, entwined and stuck in a crevasse between two rocks. There was no option but to cut it. He stuck out his left hand to give himself purchase and slashed the knife sideways. The net came free, and as it did so, Dimitrios tugged the twisted cord from the V-shaped gap in the rocks. He had been underwater for 24 seconds now, and he needed to surface. His path was blocked by a heavy weight on his shoulders. Twisting, he pushed away 2 large black boots, and saw to his horror that the boots held one full-sized, very drowned human body, trapped by one arm in the ancient rocks of Kythera. The other arm flapped free, skeletal. It had been eaten by fish, and was swaying in the morning tide. Demetrios stared at the white, bloated head, the eye sockets empty, the flesh on one side stripped from the skull, the teeth still there, the half-mouth grinning grotesquely in the clear water. It was a phantasm, straight from the imagination of the devil himself. Choking with disgust, Demetrios stared at the grisly cadaver as it continued performing its hideous slow-motion ballet just beneath the surface, the one arm and both legs rising and falling in the gentle swell, the body spotlit by the finely focused underwater rays of the clear Aegean sun. Then he turned and kicked with the frenzy of the truly terrified, desperate for air, driven by the ludicrous thought that somehow the spectre would find a way to pursue him. He glanced down as he went, and as he did so he noticed the sun creating a bright light on the dark blue jersey which covered the hideous white balloon of the waterlogged body. The light glistened upwards, reflecting thinly from a tiny the Indian Ocean. On board the United States aircraft carrier Thomas Jefferson. 9 degrees south, 92 degrees east, speed 30. They had waved him off twice now, and each time Lieutenant William R. Howell had eased open the throttle of his big F-14 interceptor attack Tomcat and climbed away to starboard, watching the speed needle slide smoothly from 150 knots to 280 knots. The acceleration was almost imperceptible, but in seconds the lieutenant saw the 6-story island of the carrier turn into a half-inch-high black thimble against the blue sky. The deep Utah drawl of the landing signal officer standing on the carrier stern was still calm. "Tomcat 201, we still have a foul deck. Gotta wave you off one more time. Just an oil leak. This is not an emergency. Repeat. Not an emergency." Lieutenant Howell spoke quietly and slowly. "Tomcat 201, roger that. I'm taking a turn around. We'll approach again from 12 miles. He eased the fighter plane's nose up, just a fraction, and felt his stomach tighten. It was never more than a fleeting feeling, but it always brought home the truth. That landing any aircraft at sea on the narrow, angled, 750-foot-long pitching landing area remains a life-or-death test of skill and nerve for any pilot. It takes most rookies a couple of months to stop their knees shaking after each landing. Pilots short of skill or nerve are normally found working on the ground, driving freight planes, or dead. He knew that there were around 20 plane-wrecking crashes on U.S. carriers each year. From the rear seat, the radar intercept officer, RIO, Lieutenant Freddie Larson, muttered, "Shit, there's about 100 of them down there, been clearing up an oil spill for a half hour. What the hell's going on?" Neither aviator was a day over 28 years old, but already they had perfected the Navy flyer's nonchalance in the face of instant death at supersonic speed. Especially Howell. "Dunno," he said, gunning the Tomcat like a bullet through the scattered low clouds, whipping past this monster twin-tailed warplane, now moving at almost 5 miles every minute. "Did you ever see a big fighter jet hit an oil pool on a carrier deck? It ain't pretty. If she slews out off a true line, you got a real good chance of killing a lot of guys, especially if she hits something and burns, which she's damn near certain to do. Try to avoid that, will you?" Freddie felt the Tomcat throttle down as Howell banked away to the left. He felt the familiar pull of the slowing engines, worked his shoulders against the yaw of the aircraft like the motorcycle rider he once had been. The F-14 is not much more than a motorbike with a 64-foot wingspan anyway. Unexpectedly sensitive to the wind at low speed, 2 rock-hard seats, no comfort, and an engine with the power to turn her into a Mach 2 rocket ship, 1,400 knots, no sweat, out there on the edge of the U.S. fighter pilot's personal survival envelope. Still holding the speed down to around 280 knots, Howell now took a long turn. The Tomcat heeled over at an angle of almost 90 degrees, the engines screaming behind him as if the sound was trying to catch and swallow him. Up ahead he could no longer see the carrier because of the intermittent white clouds obscuring his vision and casting dark shadows on the blue water. Below the two flyers was one of the loneliest seaways on Earth, the 3,500-mile stretch of the central Indian Ocean between the African island of Madagascar and the rock-strewn western coast of Sumatra. The U.S. carrier and its escorts, forming a complete 12-ship battle group, including 2 nuclear-powered submarines, were steaming towards the American naval base on Diego Garcia, the tiny atoll 500 miles south of the equator, which represents the only safe Anglo-American haven in the entire area. This was a real U.S. battle group seascape, a place where the most beady-eyed admirals and their staff worked up new missile systems, new warships, and endlessly catapulted their ace naval aviators off the flight deck, 0 to 168 knots in 2.1 seconds. This was not a spot for the faint-hearted. This was a simulated theater of war designed strictly for the very best the nation could produce. Men who possessed what Tom Wolfe immortally labeled the right stuff. Everyone serves out here for 6 interminable months at a time. Lieutenant Howell, losing height down to 1,200 feet, spoke again to the carrier's flight controllers. "Tower, this is Tomcat 201 at 8 miles. Coming in again." His words were few, and again the jet fighter began to ease down, losing height, the engines throttling marginally off the piercing high-sea shriek which would splinter a shelf of wine-glasses. Howell, insulated behind his goggles and earphones, searched the horizon for the 100,000-ton aircraft carrier. His intercom crackled. "Roger, Tomcat 201, your deck is cleared for landing now. Got your visual. Come on in, watch your altitude, and check your lineup. Winds gusting at 30 knots out of the southwest. We're still right into it. You're all set." "Roger, Tower. 6 miles." All Navy and Air Force pilots have a special, relaxed, aw-shucks way of imparting news from these high-speed fighter aircraft, some say copied directly from America's most famous combat ace, General Chuck Yeager, the first test pilot to break the sound barrier in his super-secret Bell X-1 in 1947. Talking to the tower, almost every young Navy flyer affects some kind of a West Virginian country boy drawl, precisely how they imagine General Yeager might have put it, real slow, ice calm in the face of disaster. "Got a little flame out on the old starboard engine. Just going to cut the power out there, bring her in on 1. You'll want to move the flight deck over a couple of ticks. Give me a better shot in the crosswind. It ain't a problem." Lieutenant William R. Howell imitated the general better than any of them, and easier, because he was not really Lieutenant William R. Howell anyway. He was Billy Ray Howell, whose dad, an ex-coal miner and Southern Methodist, now kept the general store back in the same hometown as Chuck Yeager, up in the western hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, Hamlin, a place of fewer than 1,000 souls, right on the Mud River, close to the eastern Kentucky border in Lincoln County. Like Chuck Yeager, Billy Ray talked about the hollers, fished the Mud River, was the son of a man who had shot a few bears in his time, can't hardly wait to get home see my dad. When he had the stick of an F-14 in his hand, Billy Ray Howell was General Yeager. He thought like him, talked like him, and acted as he knew the general would in any emergency. No matter that Big Chuck had retired to live in California. As far as Billy Ray was concerned, he and Chuck Yeager formed an unspoken, mystical West Virginia partnership in the air, and he, Billy Ray, was a kind of heir apparent. In his view, the old country way of life out among the hickory and walnut tree woods of Lincoln County gave a kid a tough center, and he was damn near sure Mr. Yeager would agree with that. The strategy had paid off, too. Billy Ray had achieved his schoolboy ambition to become a naval aviator. Years of study, years of training, had seen him close to the top of every class he had ever been in. Everyone in naval aviation knew that young Billy Ray Howell was going onwards and upwards. They had done ever since he first earned his engineering degree at the U.S. Naval Academy. No one was surprised by how good he was when he began his jet fighter training, pushing the old T-2 Buckeyes around the skies above Whiting Field, east of Pensacola in northwest Florida. And now the voice coming into the flight control area was nearly identical to that of General Yeager, the steady up-holler tone betraying no urgency. "Tower, Tomcat 201, 4 miles. I got something gone kinda weird on me right here. Landing gear warning lights just flicking some. Didn't feel the wheels locked down, but it might be something's just wrong with the old light bulb." "Tower to Tomcat 201, roger that. Continue on in and make a pass right down the deck at about 50 feet, 200 knots. That way the guys can take a close look at the undercarriage." "Roger, Tower. Coming on in." Out on the exposed and windswept carrier deck, the landing signal officer radioed instructions to the pilot and could see that Tomcat 201 was about 45 seconds out, a howling 20-ton brute of an aircraft, bucking along in the unpredictable gusts over the Indian Ocean, the pilot trying to hold her on a glide path 2 degrees above the horizontal. There was a big swell on the surface, and the whole ship, moving along at 15 knots, was pitching through about 3 degrees, 1.5 degrees either side of horizontal. That meant the ends, bow and stern, were moving through 60 feet every 30 seconds. All incoming aircraft would have a hell of an approach into the strong, hot wind, and timing the moment of impact would test the deftness and proficiency of every pilot. That was with landing wheels. The LSO Lieutenant Rick Evans, a lanky fighter pilot out of Georgia, was now standing out on the exposed port quarter of the carrier, his binoculars trained on Tomcat 201. And he could already see the landing wheels were not down, and he could see the flaps were not down either. His mind was churning. He knew that Billy Ray Howell was in trouble. Non-functioning landing gear has always been the flyer's nightmare, civil or military. But out here, it was 100 times worse. A fighter plane does not come in along the near-flat path followed by civil jetliners, which glide and then flare out a few feet above mile-long runways. Out here there's no time, and not much space. Navy flyers slammed those 22-ton Tomcats down at 160 knots, flying them right into the deck, hooked down, praying for it to grab the wire. The downward momentum on the landing wheels is astronomical. They are monster shock absorbers built to kill the entire onrushing weight of the aircraft. If the hook misses, the pilot has 1/20th of a second to change his mind, do a bolter, shove open the throttle, and blast off the bow, climbing away to starboard with the casual observation, "Coming on in again." The slightest problem with the hydraulic locking mechanism aborts the landing and, almost without exception, writes off the aircraft. Because the Navy would rather ditch a $35 million jet on its own than kill 2 aviators who have cost $2 million apiece to train. They would also much prefer the aircraft to slam into the ocean and avoid the terrible risk of a major fire on the flight deck, which a belly-down landing may cause. Not to mention the possible write-off of another 40 parked planes, and possibly the entire ship if the fire gets to the millions of gallons of aircraft fuel. Everyone on the flight deck knew that Billy Ray and Freddie would almost certainly have to ditch the jet and blast themselves out of the cockpit with the ejector, a dangerous and terrifying procedure, one which can cost any pilot an arm or a leg, or worse yet, his life. "Holy Christ!" said Lieutenant Evans miserably. By now the LSO and his team were all edging towards the deep, heavily padded pit into which they would dive for safety if Billy Ray lost control and the Tomcat plummeted into the carrier's stern. All fire crews were on red alert. Con, Captain, 4 degrees right rudder, steer 210. I want 30 knots minimum over the deck. Speed as required. Everyone could now hear the roar of the engines on the incoming Tomcat, and the bush telegraph of the carrier was working full tilt. Most everyone had a soft spot for Billy Ray. He'd been married for only a year, and half the personnel of the Naval Air Base on the Pax River in Maryland had been at the wedding. His bride, Susie Danford, was the tall, dark-haired daughter of Admiral Skip Danford. She'd met the curly-haired, dark-eyed Billy Ray with his coal miner's shoulders and sly smile long before he had become one of the Navy's elite flyers, while he was completing training at Pensacola. And now she was alone in Maryland, waiting out the endless 6 months of his first tour of sea duty. Like all aviators' wives, dreading the unexpected knock upon the door, dreading the stranger from the air base calling on the phone, the one who would explain that her Billy Ray had punched a big hole in the Indian Ocean. And there was nothing melodramatic about any of it. About 20% of all Navy pilots die in the first 9 years of their service. At the age of 26, Susie Danford Howell was no stranger to death, and the possibility of her own husband joining Jeff McCall, Charlie Rowland, and Dave Redland haunted her nights. Sometimes she thought it would all drive her crazy, but she tried to keep her fears silent. She did not know, however, the mortal danger her husband was now in. There are virtually no procedures for landing gear failure. Nothing works, save for a touch of blind luck, if the pilot can jolt down and then up, and the gears slam down and lock, putting out the warning light. But time is short. If that Tomcat F-14 runs out of gas, it will drop like a 20-ton slab of concrete and hit the long waves of the Indian Ocean like a meteorite. Billy Ray Howell and Freddie are in trouble, the word was sweeping through the carrier. On the tower side of the flight deck, Ensign Junior Grade Jim Adams, a huge black man from South Boston, dressed in a big fluorescent yellow jacket, was talking on his radio phone to the hydraulics operators on the deck below who controlled the arresting wires, one of which would grab the Tomcat, slowing it down to 0 speed in 2 seconds flat, heaving the aircraft to a halt. Big Jim, the duty arresting gear officer, had already ordered the controls set to withstand the Tomcat's 50,000-pound force slamming into the deck at 160 knots precisely, with the pilot's hand hard on the throttle in case the hook missed. But Jim knew the problem. Billy Ray Howell's in big trouble up there. Big Jim loved Billy Ray. They talked about baseball endlessly. Jim because he believed he would have made a near-legendary first batsman for the Boston Red Sox. Billy Ray because he had been a pretty good right-handed pitcher at Hamlin High. Next year their spring furlough would coincide, and they planned a jaunt to watch the Red Sox spring training for 4 days in Florida. Right now, Big Jim wished only that he could check out and fix the hydraulics on the Tomcat's landing gear, and he found himself whispering the age-old prayer of all carrier flight deck crew. Please, please, don't let him die. Please let him get out. Up on the bridge, Captain Carl Reinigan was speaking to the senior LSO back on the stern. "Has he got a hydraulics malfunction? Do not land him. Hold him up and clear." Again the big waterproof phone clutched by Lieutenant Rick Evans crackled, and the incoming voice was still slow. "Tower, this is Tomcat 201. Still got some kind of screw-up here. Tried to give her a few jolts, but it didn't work. Light's still on. I can cross the stern okay and come on by, but I don't think the hydraulics are too good. I prefer to keep the speed at 250 and take her straight back up. Get a little air underneath. No real problem. Stick's a little tough, but we got gas. Let me know." And now the F-14 was thundering in towards the stern, twice as fast as an 80-mile-per-hour Metroliner through New Jersey, and 10 times as deafening. Too fast, but still with height. "Tower to Tomcat 201, hit the throttle and pull right out. Forget the pass. Repeat, forget the pass." "Roger that," said Billy Ray Howell carefully, and he slammed the throttle forward and hauled on the stick. But nothing much happened, except for acceleration. She seemed to flatten out, and then she was diving in towards the end of the flight deck, still with 2 Phoenix missiles under her wing. Enough to blow half the flight deck to bits. Still slow and easy, Billy Ray drawled, "Tomcat 201, I'll just take a little jog to my left and get out over the port side." And he watched through his deep-set eyes as the heaving flight deck roared up to meet him. He fought to stay aloft, but the Tomcat now had a mind of its own, a bloody mind. Rick Evans, watching the F-14, now hurtling towards the port-side edge of the flight deck, snapped back into the phone, "Get out, Billy Ray! Hit it!" For a split second, Freddie Larson thought his pilot might consider ejection a sign of weakness or lack of cool, and he screamed for the first time in his flying career, "Punch it out, Billy Ray! For Christ's sake, punch it out!" The Tomcat ripped past the carrier's mast just as Lieutenant William R. Howell's right fist banged the lever. The compacted charge exploded beneath his seat and blew him headfirst out of the cockpit. Freddie followed 0.5 of a second later, the violence of the 2 explosions rendering them both momentarily unconscious. Freddie came round first, saw the Tomcat crash about 20 feet off the carrier's port bow, sending a gout of water 50 feet into the air, almost up to the flight deck. But they were clear. When Billy Ray came round, he saw his parachute canopy swinging above his head and the carrier's surging white stern wake beneath him. And even as he and Freddie hit the water, the Sea King helicopter was lifting off the deck of the carrier in a roaring whirlwind of air. Flight deck crew were emerging from cover. All landing and takeoff operations were suspended, and down in the heaving sea, half drowned despite his watertight survival suit, fighting for breath, Billy Ray Howell could hear the God-sent voice of the rescue chief yelling through the loud hailer, "Easy, guys, take it real easy. Release the chutes and keep still. We'll be right down." The big chopper came in. A 19-year-old midshipman jumped straight out into the water with the lines and made for the 2 stricken U.S. airmen. "You guys okay?" he asked. "We're a whole lot better than we would be, still in the old F-14, said Billy Ray. 35 seconds later, they were winched up to safety, trembling from shock. Freddie Larson with a broken right arm, Billy Ray with a gashed eyebrow and blood pouring down his face, which made his grin look a bit crooked. The chopper came in to land on the starboard side of the deck. 3 medics were there, plus stretcher-bearers. Lieutenant Rick Evans was also trembling, and he just kept saying over and over, "Gee, I'm just so sorry, guys, I'm just so sorry." There was a small but somber welcoming party for the 2 battered airmen. Big Jim Adams came rushing through the group against every kind of naval regulation, and he lifted Billy Ray right out of the chopper, cradling him in his massive arms, saying, "Don't you never damn die on me again, man, hear me?" Everyone could see the tears streaming down Big Jim's face. The medics then took over, giving both men a shot of painkiller, and strapping Billy Ray and Freddie into the wheeled stretchers. And the whole procession, now about 14 strong, all a bit shaken, headed for the elevators, bound together by the camaraderie of men who have looked into the face of death together. Freddie spoke first. "You are a crazy prick, Billy Ray. You should have hit the button 15 seconds earlier." "Bullshit, Freddie. I had the timing right. If I'd punched out any earlier, you'd probably be sitting up there on top of the mast right now. Yeah, and 1 second later, we'd both be sitting on the bottom of the fucking Indian Ocean." "Shit," said Billy Ray. "You're an ungrateful son of a bitch. I just saved your life, and you ain't even my real problem. Do you realize Susie's going to have a heart attack when she hears about this? Guess I'll have to blame you." "This is unbelievable." said Freddie, trying to smile, reaching out with his good arm to grasp his pilot's still shaking hand. "Want to do it again sometime?" The loss of a big Tomcat fighter aircraft is generally regarded as a career-threatening occurrence. A scapegoat is a near essential in the U.S. Navy after a foul-up which costs Uncle Sam around $35 million. Both the captain and the admiral would have to answer for this, and they had a lot of questions. Was this pilot error? Was it flight deck error? Who had checked and serviced the aircraft before it came up on deck for its last journey? Had the officer in charge of the final checkover moments before takeoff missed something? Was there any clue that the launching officer should have seen? The preliminary report would be required in the Pentagon just as soon as it could be completed, and the official inquiry was convened instantly. Hydraulics experts were called in first. The officers would routinely talk to Billy Ray and Freddie during the evening in the carrier's brilliantly equipped hospital after the surgeons had set the young navigator's arm. None of the aviators believed the pilot had made any kind of mistake, and everyone knew that Lieutenant William R. Howell had hung in there until the last possible second in order to drive his 200-knot time bomb safely out over the side of the ship. Senior officers would no doubt reach a sympathetic conclusion, but there would be real hard questions asked of the maintenance department and its specialist hydraulics engineers. While the preliminary inquiry into the accident continued, the day-to-day business of the U.S. battle group at sea also proceeded on schedule. Up in the Admiral's Bridge, Captain Jack Baldridge, the battle group operations officer, was normally in charge in the absence of the Admiral himself. But right now he was in conference on the floor below in the Radar and Electronics Nerve Center with the Tactical Action Officer and the Anti-Submarine Warfare Chief. As always, this was the most obviously busy place in the giant carrier. Always in half-light, illuminated mainly by the amber-colored screens of the computers, it existed in a strange, murmuring netherworld of its own, peopled by intense young technicians glued to the screens as the radar systems swept the oceans and skies. Jack Baldridge was a stocky, irascible Kansan from the Great Plains of the Midwest, a little town called Burdett up in Pawnee County, 40 miles northeast of Dodge City. Jack was from an old U.S. Navy family which sent its sons to sea to fight, but somehow lured them back to the old cattle ranch in the end. Jack's father had commanded a destroyer in the North Atlantic in World War II. His younger brother, Bill, was a lieutenant commander stationed outside Washington with the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence. Somewhat mysteriously, Jack thought, but young Bill was an acknowledged expert on nuclear weapons, their safety, their storage, and deployment. Most people expected that the 40-year-old Jack would become a rear admiral. Naval warfare was his life, and he was the outstanding commander in the entire battle group, shouldering significant responsibility as the group's admiral's right-hand man. His kid brother, Bill, however, who looked like a cowboy, rode a horse like a cowboy, and was apt to drive Navy staff cars like a cowboy, had gone as far as he was going. He was not a natural commander, but his scientific achievements in the field of nuclear physics and weaponry were so impressive the Navy chiefs had felt obliged to award him senior rank. Bill was a natural crisis man, a cool, thoughtful naval scientist who often came up with solutions no one had previously considered. There were several elderly admirals who did not care for him because of his unorthodox methods, but Bill Baldridge had many supporters. Where Jack was a solidly married, down-to-earth Navy captain of the highest possible quality, no one quite knew where Bill would end up, except in a variety of different beds all over Washington. At 36, he showed no signs of giving up his bachelor lifestyle and the trail of romantic havoc he had left from Dodge City to Arlington, Virginia. Jack regarded his brother with immense benevolence. Down in the electronic operations, Captain Baldridge was moving on several fronts. Captain Reinigen, in overall command of the ship, had just ordered a minor change of course as they steamed over the 90 East Ridge, which runs north-south east of the mid-Indian Basin. Here the ocean is only about a mile deep, but as the carrier pushed on along its northwesterly course, the depth fell away to almost 4 miles below the keel. Captain Baldridge had already calculated that the Tomcat probably hit the ridge as it sank and settled about 5,000 feet below the surface. He checked the positions of all the ships in the group, agreed with his ASW that 4 underwater contacts were spurious, talked briefly to the sonar controller and the link operators, checking in with the surface picture compiler. He could hear the missile gun director in conference with the surface detector, and he took a call on a coded line from Captain Art Barry, the New Yorker who commanded the 11,000-ton guided missile cruiser Arkansas, which was currently steaming about 8 miles off their starboard bow. The message was cryptic. Kansas City Royals 2, Yankees 8, $5, Art. "Son of a gun," said Baldridge. "Guess he thinks that's cute. We've just dropped a $35 million aircraft on the floor of this godforsaken ocean, and he's getting the baseball results on the satellite. Of course it would have been an entirely different matter if the message had been Royals 8, Yankees 2. Beautiful guy, Art. Gets his priorities straight." Baldridge glanced at his watch and began to write in his notebook without thinking, not for the official record, just the result of a lifetime in the U.S. Navy. He wrote the date and time in naval fashion. 22/1700, April 2002. The day, the time, 5 p.m., then month and year. Then he wrote the ship's position. Mid-Indian Ocean, 9S, 9 degrees latitude south, 91E, 91 degrees longitude east. Then, bitch of a day, Royals 2, Yankees 8, Tomcat lost, Billy Ray and Freddie hurt but safe. He, too, had a soft spot for Billy Ray Howell. April 22nd, 1709 hours. 41 degrees 30 minutes north, 29 degrees east. Course 180. Speed 4. Possible on 030, 10 miles. Come and look, Ben. Maybe okay? Thank you. Yes. Plot him, Georgi. He's a coal burner, and probably slow enough. If he keeps going for the hole and his speed suits our timetable, we'll take him. Get in, but well behind him, Georgi. Take 2 hours. April 22nd, 1912 hours. They start to look for us. Time expired 1 hour. First submarine accident signal just in, Ben. Good. What have you told the chaps? What we agree. Cover for special covert exercise. We answer nothing. Soon they stop. We not exist anymore. Okay. It'll be dark inside an hour. Now let's get organized for the transit. Watch for the light on Ruminalleteri Fortress up there on the northwest headland. Then go right in. Follow the target as close as you possibly can. Fine. Even though no one ever done it, right? Eh, Ben? My teacher once told me it could be done. Ben, I do not speak your language, and my English not as good as yours, but I know this is fucking tricky. Very bad cross currents in there, shoals on the right bank in the narrows near the big bridge. Shit, what if we hit and get stuck? We never get out of jail. If, Georgi, you do precisely as we discussed, we will not hit anything. But you still say we go right through the middle of port at 9 knots with fucking big white wake behind us. They see it, Ben. They can't fucking miss it. Do I have to tell you again? They will not see it if you keep really close, right in the middle of the Greek's wake. He won't want to run aground any more than you do. He won't push his luck in the shallow spots. Let's go, Georgi. I still not like it much. I am not telling you to like it. Do it. Remember, it is your fault if this goes wrong. If it goes wrong, that won't matter. April 22nd, 20:04 hours. I want to be in our spot early and get settled before we reach the entrance. We want a good visual night ranging mark on him. His overtaking light will do fine. Slack Greek prick. Leave them on all day. I noticed. Use height 10 meters on stern light. What about his radar, Ben? He won't see us in his ground wave, and if he does, he'll think it's his own wake. This chap is no Gorshkov. He can't even remember to turn his lights off. What about other ships in channel? Anyone overtaking will stay well to one side. Oncoming ships will keep to the other. My only real worry is the cross ferries. That's why we want to be going through the narrowest bits between 0200 and 0500, when I hope not to meet any of them. Bloody dreary if one of them slipped across our Greek leader's bum and we rammed him. How come, Ben, you know much more about everything than I do? Mainly because I cannot afford mistakes. Also because I had a brilliant teacher. Bright, impatient, clever, arrogant. Stay calm, Georgi, and do as I say. It's dark enough now. Let's range his light and close right in. April 28th, 1400 hours. 9 degrees south, 74 degrees east. Course 010, speed 12. 8 miles off Diego Garcia, the weather had worsened. The warm wind, rising and falling, making life endlessly difficult for the aviators. On the flight deck of the U.S. carrier Thomas Jefferson, the LSOs were in their usual huddle, taking advantage of the comparative quiet, talking to the pilots of the 7 incoming flights from the day's combat air patrol, 4 of them circling in a stack at 8,000 feet, 20 miles out. The day-long exercises had demanded supersonic speed tests and many landings and takeoffs. There had already been 2 burst tires, one of which had caused an incoming FA-18 Hornet strike fighter to slew left on the wire and damn near hit a parked A-6E intruder bomber. Gas was now low all around. Tensions were fairly high. And before the 6 fighters came in, the entire flight deck staff was preparing to bring down the quarterback, Hawkeye, the much bigger radar early warning and control aircraft, unmistakable because of its great electronic dome set above the fuselage. Jim Adams was calling the shots. Earphones on, yellow jacket visible for miles, he was racing through his mental checklist, yelling down the phone to the team below on the hydraulics. "Stand by for Hawkeye, 2 minutes." He knew the hydraulic system was set properly, and now his eyes were sweeping the deck for even the smallest speck of litter. No one gets a second chance out here. 1 particle of rubbish sucked into a jet engine can blow it out. The whiplash from a broken arrestor wire could kill 12 people and send an aircraft straight over the bow. Jim looked up, downwind. The Hawkeye was screaming in, the arresting wires spread-eagled on the deck, ready for the grab of the hook. Down below, the giant hydraulic piston was in position, set to withstand and stop a 75,000-pound aircraft in a controlled collision of plane and deck. "Groove!" bellowed Jim down to the hydraulic crew. This was the code word for "she's close, stand by." Seconds pass. "Short!" the key command, everyone away from the machinery. And now, as Hawkeye thundered in towards the stern, Jim Adams bellowed, "Ramp!" Every eye on the deck was steeled on the hook stretched out behind. Speech was inconceivable above the howl of the engines. The blast from the jets made the sky shimmer. At 160 knots, the wheels slammed down onto the landing surface, and right behind them the hook grabbed, the cable rising starkly from the deck in a geometric V. 1 second later, the Hawkeye stopped a few yards from the end of the flight deck, the sound of her engines dying quickly away. Suddenly there was apparent pandemonium as the deck crews raced out to haul the Hawkeye into its parking place. Jim Adams shouted into the phone to change the settings in the hydraulics. The LSOs got into position, one of them talking to the first Tomcat pilot very carefully. "Okay, 106, come on in. Wind's gusting at 35. Check your approach line. Looks fine from here. Flaps down, hook down. Gotcha, you're all set." Lieutenant William R. Howell was back in the game with a new RIO and a big plaster over his eyebrow. His pal, Jim Adams, was double-checking everything like always. One by one he shouted his commands. Groove, short, ramp, until Billy Ray was down to universal shouts of, "Good job, let's go, Billy Ray." It was always a little tense on the first landing for a crashed aviator. Up in the control tower, Freddie Larson was permitted to stand and watch, and if his arm had not hurt so badly, he too would have clapped when Billy Ray hit the deck safely. "That's my guy," he yelled without thinking. "Okay, Billy Ray." Even the Thomas Jefferson's commanding officer, Captain Reinigan, himself a former aviator like all carrier commanders, allowed himself a cautious grin. And now, with a night exercise coming up, there was a change of deck crew. The launchmen were moving into position, and aircraft were moving up from the hangars below on the huge elevators. All around there were young officers checking over the fighter-bombers, pilots were climbing aboard, another group of engines was screaming, uniformed men, many on their first tours of duty, were on their stations. The first of the Hornets was ready for takeoff. The red light on the island signaled 4 minutes to launch. 2 minutes later the light blinked to amber. A crewman, crouching next to the fighter's nose wheels, signaled the aircraft forward and locked on the catapult wire. The light turned green. Lieutenant Skip Martin, the shooter, pointed his right hand at the pilot, raised his left hand, and extended 2 fingers. Go to full power. Then, palm out, hit the afterburners. The pilot saluted formally and leaned forward, tensing for the impact of the catapult shot. The shooter, his eyes glued on the cockpit, saluted, bending his knees and touching 2 fingers of his left hand onto the deck. Skip Martin gestured, "Forward." A crewman, kneeling in the catwalk narrowly to the left of the big fighter jet, hit the button on catapult 3 and ducked as the outrageous hydraulic mechanism hurled the Hornet on its way, screaming down the deck, its engines roaring flat out, leaving an atomic blast of air in its wake. Everyone watched, even veterans almost holding their breath as the aircraft rocketed off the carrier and out over the water, climbing away to port. "Tower to Hornet 160, nice job there. Course 54, speed 400, go to 8,000. Hornet 160, roger that." April 28th, 1835 hours. 35 degrees north, 21 degrees east. Course 270. Speed 5. "Ben, we got rattle up forward." "Damn. We'll have to stop and surface as soon as possible to fix it. We can't afford to travel 1 more mile with that." "No problem. I will fix soon as it's dark. Very quiet here anyway." April 29th. 05:23 hours. At least the rattle's gone, but I really am very sad about your man. It sounds heartless. I don't mean it to be so, but I just hope they never find his body. No time look any more. Not blame anyone, just freak wave. I seen it before. Now we say good Catholic prayer for him. I should like to join you in that. May 4th, 1900 hours. 7 degrees south, 72 degrees east. Course 270, speed 10. Inside the mess room of the Thomas Jefferson, still off Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, Big Jim Adams was giving a party in the aviator's officer's room. 4 hours earlier he had received a message that his wife Carol had given birth to their first son, a 9-pound boy whose name would be Carl Edward Adams. This, Jim explained, had been agreed 2 years ago, the first name for the long-time Red Sox outfielder Carl Yastrzemski, the second for the legendary Red Sox hitter Ted Williams. And now little Carl Edward had come into land, and the aviators on the carrier were exercising 2 of their other major skills, making their 2 cans of beer, newly permitted on the 60th day out, last for about 4 hours, and feeling truly sorry for other human beings on planet Earth who were not involved in the flying of jet fighter planes off the decks of the biggest aircraft carriers in the world. A visiting commanding officer from one of the destroyers, Captain Roger Peterson, trying to dine in peace in a far corner with Captain Reinigan, remarked to him that it takes a crew of more than 3,000 men to keep the boisterous, white-scarved, winged heroes in the air. No one heard, and it would scarcely have mattered if they had, because the one shining fact known to any aviator is that all other forms of life, including submariners, especially submariners, guided missile experts, gunnery officers, navigation and strategic advanced warfare staff, were and would ever be their absolute inferiors. Meanwhile, Big Jim was up on his feet, sipping his second can of iced beer, the last of his ration, making a little speech, in which he announced that Lieutenant Howell was to be Carl Edward's godfather. This provoked yells of derision that Billy Ray was a godless hillbilly, and poor little Carl Edward would receive no moral guidance in his whole life. Billy Ray stood up and told them that in his opinion such criticism was essentially bullshit, since his dad was a church-going Methodist back home in Hamlin, and that he considered himself an ideal choice. This caused Big Jim to stand up and admit that Billy Ray was only his second choice, but that since Yaz had not made himself available, he was happy to move the selection process from an outfielder to a hillbilly. Anyway, he had instructed Carol to give birth while he was at sea, because that would allow him to be first man off the ship when the Thomas Jefferson finally returned home in September. May 4th, 1500 hours. 36 degrees north, 3 degrees west. Course 270. Speed 5. Okay, Ben. Here's island now. Can't see much on red 40. Visibility not good. Anyone live there? Don't know. Maybe few Spanish fishermen, but empty. Maybe your teacher say city size of Moscow there, but no one notice. No. He told me it was empty, too. Anyway, you have plans for Straits? I have no requirements whatsoever, except we do not get caught. You've driven through here many times, I'm sure. Yes, but long time back. And Americans have better surveillance now. They got suspicious last time, maybe satellite photo. Now how you make another miracle, Ben? How we go through in secret? Basically, Georgi, old man, we have only one choice. Very slowly, very quietly, and hope to God no one really sees us. No problem with that, I agree. You expect message from boss? Not yet. Not until the final phase. Possibly not till the fuel turns up. Possibly not at all. Okay, I make crew accept story, but this is long journey. They'll be well rewarded in the end. From here on, we must take extra care again. We'll stay in silent drive at 5 knots for 48 hours. Ultra quiet, please, Georgi. May 6th, 1200 hours. Fort Meade, Maryland. Vice Admiral Arnold Morgan director of the National Security Agency, a short, hard-eyed Texan with grimly trimmed white hair, sat alone behind his desk. He was normally on 3 telephones, growling orders that would be relayed by satellite to his agencies throughout the world. The Admiral's reputation was that of a voracious and dangerous spider at the center of a vast electronic web of Navy intelligence resources. Most of the time he just watched. But when Admiral Arnold spoke, men jumped on 4 continents and the oceans surrounding them. Right now the Admiral was curious. Open wide on his desk was the weighty current edition of Jane's Fighting Ships, the British Bible of the world's warships. He had not expected it to provide an answer, nor did it. Neither did 3 other highly classified naval reference books, which were also piled around his desk. Late on the previous evening, he had received a satellite message. It had not been urgent, or alarming, or even particularly informative. It was nonetheless distinctly unsatisfactory, and something about it irritated Arnold Morgan. The story was simple. Gibraltar facility picked up very short transient contact on very quiet vessel at May 5th, 0438 hours. Insufficient hard copy data for firm classification. Oral, compressed cavitation, 1 shaft, 5 blades, probably non-nuclear. No information on friendly transits relate. Admiral Morgan understood that someone with very sharp ears on the other side of the Atlantic had heard a noise in the water for a matter of 20 to 30 seconds which sounded a lot like a non-nuclear powered submarine. It was propelling on a single shaft with a 5-bladed screw. It was probably well offshore, almost certainly below the surface, and had made the noise either by speeding up somewhat carelessly or by putting its screw too shallow for the revolutions set. Perhaps she had momentarily lost trim, pondered the Admiral, himself an ex-submariner, and one time commanding officer of a nuclear boat. In the good old days, it was possible to discern a Soviet-built boat because of their insistence on 4- or 6-bladed props when Western nations went for odd numbers of blades, 3, 5, or 7. If Admiral Morgan closed his eyes tightly and cast his thoughts back 23 years to his own days in the sonar room of a boomer, deep in his mind he could hear again the distinctive swish, 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 swish of the blades on a distant old Soviet Navy submarine. They used to be hard to miss, but it was much more difficult nowadays to identify any submarine. Even modern, quiet fishing trawlers can make this kind of noise if they speed up suddenly and inadvertently hassle the haddock. But Admiral Morgan had no interest in fishermen. The only furtive, 5-bladed fucker he would worry about was a submarine, and he could sort that out pretty quickly. Admiral Morgan was a living, snarling encyclopedia when it came to checking out foreign warships. He wanted to know what kind of contact it was, who the hell was driving it, and where the hell it was going. The merest possibility of a submarine had that effect on him. It took about 5 minutes on the computer for the Admiral to figure out that it could not have been an American or British boat. A bit longer to find out that it could not have been French or Spanish either. Israel had one submarine of Russian origin in service that he knew of, but there was a record of it entering the Atlantic 4 weeks ago. So it was not them. The goddamned Iranians had 3 they bought from Russia, but they had all been accounted for in the Gulf recently, thoroughly enough for him to know that none of them were that far from home. He knew the Indonesians had some old and defunct Russian boats which were unlikely to have cleared the breakwater in safety. Even the Algerians had a couple of kilos, brand new in 1995, but both were back in refit, he knew, in St. Petersburg. The Poles had one in the Baltic. The Romanians one in the Black Sea, both out of action and both recently observed. The Libyan's Kilo fared no better than its 6 Foxtrot predecessors, 2 of which sank alongside. It had not been to sea for a year. The Chinese had quite a few submarines, too, but none of these people had any known business in the strait. He had already played a long shot and placed a call to his opposite number in the Russian Navy in Moscow. It was all very cheerful these days, and without hesitation the Russians told him they had not sent any of their diesel boats through the strait for 18 months. In fact, the only Russian diesel unaccounted for was lost in an accident in the Black Sea about 3 weeks ago, and was right now resting in 700 meters of water with everyone in it dead. They were still searching, but so far had only found her special indicator buoys drifting and a small amount of debris. All of which baffled Admiral Morgan. He kept repeating to himself the same scenario. If one of the U.S. Navy's sonar wizards said he had heard a quiet propeller, then the Admiral believed there had to be a suspicion in that operator's mind. Only a few people can even detect these subtle, distant sound waves, and even fewer can recognize them. And if this man in Gibraltar said he had identified 1 shaft and 5 blades, then that was precisely what he had done. But this guy had not only bothered to report it, he had also included a veiled personal suspicion that it was probably non-nuclear. "I think our man suspects it was underwater," Morgan thought. "The contact was transient, and the trouble with all transients is their similarity to code breaking. If you have just a small sample, you don't really know much. Just enough to want to know a bit more. Like what precisely is the type of boat and who's driving the bastard. But our new friends in Moscow are saying no, and why should they lie? Not only are we at peace, we could not give a rat's ass if they drove a diesel up and down the Atlantic all year, calling at all stations. If they pitched up in Norfolk, Virginia, hell, we'd probably give 'em a cup of coffee." When he had first seen the message, he did not understand, and he still didn't. The facts seemed mutually exclusive, a mental outcome guaranteed to infuriate him.
This ends Disc 1.